so this, Jim's put together a PowerPoint presentation on Columbia Records this time. Last time was
RCA.
RCA, that's right. And so we'll have this presentation posted on the website after we're done, and we're recording this video, this Zoom meeting, and so that'll be available on the SFAS YouTube channel. And after we go through the Columbia Records, we are lucky enough to get JR to talk a little bit about Stylus geometry and why that's important.
Yeah, very good. Okay. Well, Columbia Records derives its name origin from the District of Columbia. It was originally the Columbia Phonograph Company, founded in 1888, and distributed Edison phonographs and recorded cylinders throughout the Washington, D.C. area. In 1894, the company ended its ties with Edison and began selling its own manufactured recordings. Columbia began selling disc records in 1901. The two main competitors for Columbia in the recorded music sales just after the turn of the century was Edison with its cylinders and the Victor Company with disc records. By 1912, Columbia was selling exclusively disc records. Oop, I'm having a problem. This not. Oh, there we go. Columbia Records became, let me make sure. Okay. Columbia Records became a leader in jazz and blues after purchasing the OK Record Company in 1926. The purchase added Louis Armstrong and Clarence Williams to a roster of artists that already included Bessie Smith. In 1938, Columbia Records was purchased by the Columbia Broadcasting Company, or CBS, beginning a long collaboration between the broadcasting and recording companies. Columbia Records became a leader in pop music in the 1940s with the popularity of Frank Sinatra. In the 1940s, Columbia Records also began experimenting with longer playing high fidelity discs to replace the 78 RPM records. The first pop LP officially released was the reissue of Frank Sinatra's The Voice of Frank Sinatra in 1946. In 1948, Columbia Records introduced the standard 33.5 RPM LP that would become a music industry standard for nearly 50 years. Columbia's 33 RPM format quickly spelled the death for the classical 78, and for the first time in nearly 50 years, gave Columbia a commanding lead over RCA Victor. In 1951, Columbia US began issuing records in the 45 RPM format that RCA Victor had introduced 2 years earlier. The same year, Columbia US also severed its decades-long distribution arrangement with EMI and signed a distribution deal with Philips Records to market Columbia recordings outside North America. Apparently, American Columbia was not happy with EMI's reluctance to introduce long-playing records. In 1961, CBS ended its affiliation with Philips Records and formed its own international organization, CBS Records International, in 1962. This subsidiary label released Columbia Records outside the US and Canada on the CBS label until 1964, marketed by Philips in Britain. With the formation of CBS Records International, CBS started establishing its own distribution networks in the early 1960s. Can you mute yourself?
I'm just so excited that he hit both his blocks out at the Olympic Games. That was a very solid.
Could that be muted? Thank you. Singer and composer Mitch Miller was lured away from Mercury Records in 1950. He became head of artists or A&R and soon became responsible for signing key recording artists to the label. Tony Bennett, Doris Day, Rosemary Clooney, Johnny Mathis soon became Columbia recording stars. Columbia Records began recording music in stereo in 1956, but because no one had yet figured out how to produce a stereo phono cartridge, the first stereo LPs weren't introduced until 2 years later in 1958. And thank you to Gregory for that little bit of information. Most of the early stereo recordings were classical music. Mitch Miller personally disliked rock music, and he made no secret of his taste. Columbia Records did move into the growing folk music market, with Bob Dylan being signed to the label and released his first album in 1962. Simon and Garfunkel was added to the artist lineup soon thereafter. Barbra Streisand became a pop mainstay for Columbia Company when she was signed in '63. Mitch Miller left Columbia for MCA in '65, and it was not long after before rock became a key part of Columbia Records' story. Clive Davis was appointed president of Columbia in '67. He signaled a strong venture into rock music when he signed Janis Joplin after attending the Monterey International Pop Festival. So something on album jackets. Many album covers made by Columbia and the other major labels were put together using one piece of cardboard folded in half and two paper slicks, one for the front and one for the back. But then Columbia discovered that printing two front cover slicks, one for the mono, one for stereo, was inefficient and needlessly costly. So starting in '59, they went to the paste over front slick, which had the stereo information printed on the top and the mono information printed on the bottom. For stereo issues, they moved the front slick down so the stereo information was shown at the top and the mono information was bent over around the bottom to the back and pasted over by the back slick. Conversely, for a mono album, they moved the slick up so the mono information showed at the bottom and the stereo information was pasted over, bending over on the top side. So we're talking about early Columbia Records. They had a marketing ploy where they had these brilliant blue laminated records and labels called the Royal Blue issues, which were made from 1932 through 1935. The Columbia plant in Oakland, California did Columbia's pressings for sale west of the Rockies and continued using the Royal Blue material for these until the mid-1936. The Columbia trademark from 1938 into the 50s was two overlapping circles with the magic notes on the left side and the CBS microphone on the right circle, as you can see in the picture. The Royal Blue labels now disappeared in favor of a deep red, which caused RCA Victor to claim infringement on its Red Seal trademark, although it's noted that RCA lost the case. The blue Columbia label was kept for its classical music, the Columbia Masterworks Records line, until it was later changed to a green label before switching to gray, and then eventually bronze, which I guess is what was familiar in the 50s and 60s for the classical and Broadway albums. So with 1954, Columbia US decisively broke with its past when it introduced the new walking eye logo designed by Columbia's art director, Neo Fujita. This logo actually depicts a stylus, the legs, on a record, the eye. However, the eye also subtly refers to CBS's main business in television and that division's iconic eye logo. Columbia continued to use the Notes and Mic logo on record labels and even used a promo label showing both logos until the Notes and Mic were phased out, along with the 78 in 1958. By the later half of 1961, Columbia started using pressing plants with newer equipment. The deep groove pressings were made on older pressing machines where the groove was an artifact of the metal stamper being affixed to a round center block to assure the resulting record would be centered. Newer machines used parts with a slightly different geometry that left only a small ledge where the deep groove used to be. This changeover, however, did not happen all at once, as different plants replaced machines at different times, leaving the possibility that both deep groove and ledge varieties could be original pressings. The changeover took place starting in 1961. And we all know a lot of people talk about collecting, deep grooves, and it's especially in the early 60s. But I guess you could have a recording that didn't have a deep groove, and it could actually been produced basically in the same year that one of the deep grooves was. So I found that very interesting. Columbia Records owned and operated some of the most respected recording studios of all time. They housed their first studio in the Woolworth Building in New York City. It opened in 1913, and it was the site of recording of some of the earliest jazz recordings. The Columbia 30th Street studio in New York was nicknamed the Church because it originally housed the Adams Parkhurst Memorial Presbyterian Church. It was operated from 1948 to 1981. And among the legendary recordings created there was Miles Davis' Kind of Blue, Leonard Bernstein's 1957 Broadway cast recordings of West Side Story, and Pink Floyd's 1979 The Wall. The location of the Columbia Records headquarters and studios of the late 1970s are immortalized in Billy Joel's landmark album, 52nd Street. I didn't know that before either. So here's an example of an early 1950s US silver on black label. And you can see just above the long plane microgroove, you still see the note and microphone label. This is 1954 to 1958, still before the 6 eyes and the eye labels, where the label is now red, but you still have the double circle with the notes, the magic notes, and the microphone at the bottom above long plane. And here in 1956, we have the beginning of the US, the well-known 6 eye label. This one being a mono. And then here's the stereo version in the same time, basically the same time period, where you would have the stereo fidelity at the top of the 2 arrows. It's still a 6 eye, of course, and you can see this looks like it's probably a deep groove. The 6 eye Columbias were the stars of the 50s audiophile recording, engineering, and pressing. However, around 1961, corporate changes at Columbia were signaled by the introduction of the CBS name in addition to Columbia overprinted at 12 o'clock. You can see the little CBS logo just under the word Columbia. Why did that happen? Sorry. That's in my way. Here we go. The CBS 6 eyes may be inferior sonically to the original editions, at least according to the sources I was reading online, although many labelographies omit the CBS overprint edition. All right, why is it doing that? You have an idea? Let's try this again. Here we are. Okay. Is this line here, you guys, is this in your way or is this only on my screen?
Only yours.
Oh, all right. Well, good. Let me see if I can move it down out of the way. Very good. Okay. So there's some alternative orange 6 eyes in the 1956 and 1962 time period. Instead of red, they're now orange. So there are red and orange versions of this label. And the stereo labels look a little different than the mono shown here. The stereo labels have a broad, thick rim with Columbia printed at the bottom center, and the stereo fidelity, we already mentioned, printed at the top center. Early versions of the Columbia 6 eyes have no reference to CBS on the label, whereas the 1961 to 62 releases show this again, CBS at the top center for both mono and stereo labels. So just from what I read is that if you can find them without the CBS, that apparently the versions without CBS are better sonically. So this is the first version of the Columbia 2i, which was starting in 1962 to 1963. And here is a second version of the Columbia 2i with the white lettering at top. This was used from 63 through 1970. And then here is what they call a Columbia 1i. There's no actual walking eye on it. This was used from 1970 well into the 1990s. I think we all have a few of these for sure in our collections. And this is kind of a cheat sheet, which you'll be able to get off, the lecture on our website, which I thought was kind of nice I was going to print a copy of this for myself just to have, especially when I go record hunting. It just has everything laid out. And then there's the Columbia Masterworks label, which is their classical music label. And this shows they followed pretty much the same kind of time course and labelography, with the early ones being the 6 eyes, and then moving to the 2 eyes, and then eventually the 1 eye, or losing the eyes in 1970. So to talk a little bit about the pressing plant. So Columbia at one time had 5 plants in operation. Over time, they consolidated into 3. Terre Haute, Indiana, was from 1953 to 82, Pittman, New Jersey from 1960 to 86, and Santa Maria, California, 1963 to 1981. Bridgeport, Connecticut, and Hollywood Drive plants transferred their successor plants, Pittman and Santa Maria, into the successor plants, Pittman and Santa Maria. With the 1960s and 70s jazz LPs, 2 of the 3 are readily identifiable by trail-off etchings in the matrix area, the T and sometimes a Columbia in New York, and distinctive font yellow-orange for Indiana and bright yellow in New York. There's apparently no noticeable sonic difference between the pressings from any of Columbia's different plants, at least according to the source I got online. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the Columbia matrix and runout information. Well, unfortunately, unlike RCA, the matrix codes for Columbia are not as straightforward or consistent or even as useful, in my opinion. All the lacquers that are cut are numbered in a standard matrix code format, stamped into the vinyl land lacquer between the grooves and the label. So typically you might see an XLP followed by 4 or 5 numbers, a dash, and then another number, and then a letter. XLP represented mono, XSM for stereo. The 5-digit coding serial number had to do with the actual recording number. And then in terms of the actual, then there was a dash, and then the first number represented the actual tape or take that was being used to create the lacquer. So there was a tape mix identifier, often just a 1, but if a particular album had more than 1 take or 1 tape used, you would then sometimes see a 2 or a 3. And then you would have the alpha lacquer identifier starting with an A through L with 11 unique letters in the first cohort, then 2 letters, an AA to AL, and then BA to BL, and so forth and so on. So in the Steve Hoffman forums, they claim that the Columbia cuttings are the A is the first cutting, B is the second cutting or lacquer, C is the third cutting, and so forth. Where AA would be the 12th cutting or lacquer, with AB being the 13th. But according to Fremer, this is not correct. I gotta move this out of the way. An initial lacquer order was 6 sets, plus a reference for QC, and each plant would get 2 copies at the same time. In other words, the claim that A is the first cutting, B is the second and third is incorrect. In fact, 1A through F were all first cuttings and could represent the first pressings. Any change in the program, as I mentioned, or tape mix triggers a change in the number, like to 2. Another change might change it to 3. For example, a revised mix or a different take of 1 or more tracks or a different take entirely. In Bob Dylan's Highway 61 Revisited, he had a different version from Buick 6, as did the latter ones. So the 1A through Fs had the original fast version, while the 3, or let's say A or 3A through F had the slower one, no doubt changed per Bob Dylan's request. You can also find information, as I mentioned earlier, in the inner groove area. You would sometimes see a CTH, which represented Columbia Terre Haute, a CP, Columbia Pittman, or a CS or a CSM, Columbia Santa Maria. So with multiple lacquers cut simultaneously from one tape source, distributed to a number of different plants across the US, and a string of mothers and stampers from each lacquer, and say 1,000 to 2,500 pressings from each stamper, any individual record could be anywhere in that chain of production. Of note, unlike RCA, which frequently had the mother and actual stamper information in the dead wax, I can find anywhere online where that information exists with Columbia. So there's no reason to believe that any one master lacquer sounds better than another lacquer from the same tape cut around the same time. Playing the original master tape a dozen times, the artists and engineers probably had played it already a few times, doesn't create significant loss of information in a way that applying hundreds of tons of pressure to a metal stamper does. The most important determinant of vinyl audio quality remains the place, of course, of a record between the first off of a fresh stamper and the last off of a worn stamper. The stamper grooves being progressively deformed by pressing repetition. The only indicator of first or early place in a stamper life, at least with Columbia, is the test pressing and possibly initial run of promo copies. Other than that, apparently there's no way of predicting audio quality better than just simply listening. So that is my talk. Any comments, questions, corrections, etc.?
So was it completely a coincidence that Columbia merged with CBS, who's also called Columbia?
I don't know. I didn't see that. I just know that CBS bought Columbia. Maybe they were attracted to their name. I don't know.
Yeah, curious.
Good question, but I don't have an answer for that. If anyone else wants to chime in, that's fine.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
As I understand it, CBS bought Columbia Records in the late 1930s.
Right.
So they've owned it, so that's CBS. We knew it's a television company, but they were in radio before. So they bought the record company towards the end of the Depression.
Right.
And then, so they owned it.
Yeah.
And I guess that the commonality of their names between the seller and the purchased is just a coincidence.
Yeah, I thought that too, but then I read, all I can say is I read something about the history of the label, and it was fairly independent, I think, till the 1930s.
Mm-hmm.
And during the Depression, it was going downhill, and I think Paley bought them. So that's more or less accurate. I mean, definitive remains to be seen.
I would say I was kind of disappointed that there wasn't more information in the matrix, with Columbia, because with RCA, you can frequently see what mother it is and what stamper it is, which is really great for a collector. But again, with Columbia, other than knowing what the labels look like, looking for a deep groove, I get, at least we'll tell you it's early 60s, and, whether or not it has that little CBS overprinted. Other than that, it's going to be kind of hard to tell whether something, is, the fifth mother, or, what stamper it is, and you're just going to have to buy it and listen to it, I guess.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, I had trouble with my microphone, so I had to restart everything. So going back a few questions, I've got the book right here. And I actually pulled it up. So Columbia is named after District of Columbia,
Right.
where it was started. And I don't know, I haven't gotten that far in the book to find out if CBS and Columbia naming conventions were, a coincidence or whatever. But I wanted to bring up a couple of things. One thing that was left out that, I don't know if you're into these things, which I think about all the time, I'm sure you guys do too. There's also a difference in the matte versus semi-gloss of the label, depending on original pressings. But the main thing I wanted to bring up is that, are you guys familiar with this London Jazz Collector website?
I got some of my information for the talk.
Well, that guy kind of cracked the code on this. And like what you mentioned, Michael Fremmer says, the lacquers would be created in a like A, B, C, D, but it would be like A, B, A, C, A, D, and so on. And it's possible, according to, the research that this guy has done, that an AA pressing could be a first as well as like an AF pressing, but it could just be distributed to a different plant or something like that.
Right. They mentioned that for any particular record, they would press 6 plus 8, whatever, and they'd all at the same time from the first tape. But those are the original lacquers, of course, and those, and then send 2 to each of their plants, and they'd all be, making their mothers and their stampers out of it. But
one thing, it's like sort of the A1 pressing is always held up as this holy grail very first pressing, but it's not necessarily the case. And the other thing is that people will turn to or they'll reference the promo copy as being evidence of the pure original. And in the case of, say, Kind of Blue, the promo copy has a later stamper than some of the earlier ones. So maybe that was a last minute decision or whatever. So it's like, the internet is undoing a lot of the preconceived, set in stone wisdom of a lot of this stuff.
right, there's whole websites dedicated to nothing but Kind of Blue, and all the versions of it, and the label changes and all that. And I didn't want to get into that because we got another speaker tonight. That's
completely confusing. Yeah,
Yeah.
Completely confusing.
As I said, with RCA, it's much more straightforward. Where a 1A, it's giving you information about mother and stamper, and it's not talking about which lacquer it is. And there's way more information. If you go back and look at the talk I gave, there's just the matrix information gives you way more information for.
I think it'll tell you who mastered it and stuff like that.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
Columbia much less so. But it is
Jim.
Yeah.
Jim, my dad, when he had the radio stations, I used to get a lot of those records for free. He'd just give them to me because they'd get duplicates, 3 and 4 copies of the same thing. But he always claimed that, especially with the Columbia, the ones that were, because they just rubber stamp them with a rubber stamp and ink promotional copy. He always claimed those were the better copies to get.
Well,
because they sounded better and they lasted longer.
Right. And according to, again, the references online, for what it's worth, with Columbia, since you don't know the mother and you don't know which stamp, if you can buy a promo copy, it's probably going to be earlier in the printing process. Maybe not every time, but in generalities, there's probably some truth to that.
That's where I got all my good classical recordings.
Lucky you.
So Jim, another question here. So they cut 6 of them together, but they don't cut them simultaneously. They don't have 6 cutters. They cut the A first, then this, then B, then C.
Well, they're right. They're being cut off of
So
the.
that means it's the tape is read again and again. So the tape itself, by the time you get to the 6th, is probably worse than the first.
Well, again, it was indicated in the research I did that playing a tape 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times, the amount of loss you get is not, because it is not, it's not like you're making a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy.
No.
Right? That we know you get lost, but just playing it a few times, I
Yeah.
don't know that you're going to get any discernible loss, especially
Okay.
compared to.
Okay, so why is there a problem then with the G? I mean, like after the 7th one, because it's the same tape.
It may not be. That's right. No, I mean, it just, so the point is that.
It's just a time frame, you know.
So
The
one
first 6 were the first batch. Yeah, the first 6 were the first batch, so they sold first. They made stampers from those and they sold those records first. So time-wise, they're first, but quality-wise, I'm not sure.
That's
So a known issue with tapes is that they don't hold up well with long times. They just degrade sitting on the shelf.
It just dry out.
Ah, there you go.
Yeah.
It's dry out, yeah.
right. But if you know from the label that you have a record that was produced in the first 2, 3, 4, 2 years, couple years of a record being released, and you have, one copy that's it says 1A on one side and it could say 1A on one side and 1C on the other side. And then you have another copy that's a 1G and a 1F. There's no indication that other than listening to it, that one will be any different sonically than the other. So
I totally agree with that, because I've got records where it's like 1A on the front, on the A side, and it's like 1F on the B side. What does that indicate? Does that mean 1A, the stamper was just used to death, or what?
again, those letters only are,
Yeah.
what I've read, only referring to the lacquer, and that's that's way before the stamper. Remember, the lacquer makes the mother or the father in some cases, but let's just keep it simple. The lacquer makes the mother makes the stamper, and then the stamper is used to produce the record. So, you could have a 1A produce, so one lacquer can produce. So the way it works is that the lacquer produces, let's say, the father, and that's a negative of the lacquer, and the lacquer is destroyed when the father is made. The father then makes all the mothers, and we'll make, let's say, like 5 mothers, and then the mothers and then from each mother you can make 5 or 10 or X number of stampers, and then each stamper can make anywhere from 1,000 to 2,500 records off of each stamper before getting into bad degraded quality. So again, according to what I read, we're only talking about the lacquer. So that doesn't speak really anything to the quality.
That's right.
So Peter, can you hear the difference between the two sides of that album?
I have only had the chance to do one test. I've got a copy of Dave Brubeck Timeout, and where I've got the original 6i 1A, I've got the CBS 6i, I've got the first 2i, and then I've got a 70s Columbia orange label, or whatever, 1i, whatever you want to call it. And the sound does noticeably degrade in that instance. But like he's saying, I mean, when you talk about stamper runs, some people say that there's sort of a sweet spot in the middle of the run where the stamper is going and the pucks are melting at the right rate. Everything is perfect. You get a good record.
So you the one copy that had markedly different numbers on the two sides. So I was wondering,
I don't have anything. I don't want to. I don't consider it a valid comparison unless I have like something to compare it to, and I don't.
Apples to apples.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
Again,
I'll tell you this, I have noticed that I have 2 copies of the same record with the same pressing and the same matrix numbers, and one sounds better than the other. So
Yeah, we
to
don't know
make
the
a,
history.
So Peter, would you say
You
my
know the
professional
history of-
copy that I got from the radio station might have different numbers on it than the one you have? And I have that album professional.
I mean,
Yeah,
again, he's
Quebec.
talking about promo copies. I, I'm going by what I hear. I would bet that promo
Okay.
copies of classical records would be deliberately sort of first run or hand selected to sound better. But I doubt if that is the case with pop and other kind of rock records.
Yeah, Brubeck
you
was
know.
pop.
Certainly later on. I mean, but
Yeah.
the early days of jazz, the late 50s, 60s, through the early mid 60s, maybe, but I don't know. I mean, you
Yeah.
can tell us what your book says later on.
Yeah.
Well, but here's a question. I mean, we're talking about 50 years later, 60 years later. I mean, what's the history of that particular record that you bought, right? You bought 10 years ago, so there was a 50-year history to it.
Oh, yeah, that's true too.
Well, I mean,
so how do you? I mean, I don't think you can listen today and determine what was the quality in day one.
yeah. I mean, these are like super nice copies of these records as best as I could find. But again, I think there's so many variables at play. When you get into, if you go read like what he was talking about, that London Jazz Collector website, the guy goes in depth to the point where you can't even, you would need to study this for days to really comprehend the whole distribution network of these lacquers and the stamping, and who knows what practices were in place in Indiana versus Santa Maria, California. The weather could affect these things. I mean, there's so many different variables at play.
Yeah,
You really have to play the record.
and I can imagine, different plants have different machinery to make their the mudders and the stampers, and it just and the operators on a particular day.
Yeah, how
some
stoned are
just
they
on a
that
horse,
particular day?
I mean, I'm looking like I'm looking at I'm in silicon production, so I'm looking at the same plant. One day is great, the next day awful. So
Yeah.
I'm looking at this. This is probably worse distribution of quality between the plants and between the operators and between the suppliers of the materials.
Well, then the other thing that I always hear about, and I have no way to verify this, is that the playback equipment of the time in the 50s apparently was not good enough to pull out all the information from these discs anyway.
Oh,
So,
no.
that's what I hear. I don't know if that's true. If you guys have any,
Yeah, probably true.
I don't know. I think only Bernie is old enough to remember what the playback of the machines were like in the 1950s, but
They use those Fairchild arms on those great big
Yeah.
turntables that were about what, 19, maybe 20 inches across.
Or the
They would
gauge.
back cue them, and you had to have a stylus, and that Fairchild thing ran like a tank, if I remember rightly.
Right.
Because I remember my dad would sit there like this and have a couple of them all queued up, and when it was ready to go, man, you just hit it.
yeah, getting back to what Peter said, I think one of the exciting things about collecting vinyl is that the hardware caught up with the software and that the information was always there, and they never really were able to get it out until the last 30 or so years with the advent of really much better
Better accuracy.
than cartridges. And
Yeah, that's true.
I think we should move on unless someone has any other burning criticism or questions or anything, so we can
Well,
give
Jim, I just have one comment that Anthony came over to my house to hear my system. And I had sitting there a copy of the, I forget what it was, but he said, hey, I want to hear that. And it was on a London recording. And I put it on and he goes, God, where'd that bass come from? And I said, it came from the record because they put it in there, because I said Columbia and RCA wouldn't do that because they were so concerned about getting all this music on the record. They forgot about the quality in reference to Decca and ours and London.
I don't know if that's true. I have some.
Well, a lot of them I can hear the difference. It's the major Scheherazade. It is in the beginning, that opening, and I got about 4 copies of it, and one on that London with what is that? James Locke as the engineer, and it's phenomenal the way it opens.
is this the
That
70s London?
explains the trademark full frequency range recording.
That's right.
Well, I listen to a lot of Londons, and some of them are very good, and I would say some of them are not that great, at least in my collection. But you know what? Maybe the next time we'll talk about London. I can get someone else to talk about London, but
Yeah, they're part of Decca, aren't they?
I think there's association there.
Yes, they are.
JR, you are on, man.
Yeah, I
Thank
just,
you, Jim.
I just-
Thanks.
Yeah.
I just put a link up in the chat of a funny variation by Elvis Costello of the one eye label. I ran across this on Steve Hoffman. So if you click on that link, you'll see an amusing variation of the Columbia label.
Thank you.
Hey, hi, hello, guys. Thanks for having me. It's my can you hear me well?
Yep.
All right. Jim, it's my understanding you want me to go into the major components of a cartridge setup, but at a higher altitude. Why each component, say VTF, VTA, and so on, is important. Not so much how to do it, but why.
Right, not so much how to. That's a multi-hour. Right. But in addition to the importance of each, whether it's Zenith or Azimuth or, VTF or SRA or whatever,
Yeah.
but specifically what quintessentially you might hear in your system if you really fuck it up and you don't get it right.
Yeah.
Or like, if you get Zenith way off, it's sound going to be shifting one direction. You know what I'm talking about. So
Okay. All right. Thank you. So I'm going to speak rather extemporaneously on this subjects then, and I'm going to share some images and some gifs. But before I start on that material, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page with regards to the anatomy of a stylus and a stylus cantilever assembly and how grooves are formed. Once we're all on the same page there, I think the rest of this will come a little easier. So let me share my screen. Okay. Are you seeing my screen right now?
we are.
All right. Now, if I press this button, it should go full. Let's see. Control F5. Slideshow. Okay. Are you seeing this thing move? You see this GIF moving right now? Okay. All right. So first, I just want to show you how grooves are formed. All right. So this is a diagrammatic illustration of a cutter head and its stylus. Of course, the stylus. Do you see my mouse, by the way?
Yes.
You do. You do. Okay.
Yes.
So the orange reddish tip on the bottom, that's the cutter head stylus, and of course the cutter head are these two coils. They're operating out of phase with each other. And right now, what is being cut is a right channel signal, right channel only. Okay, so we're only getting one side of the cutter head is moving, and it's forming a groove that, if you look from a bird's eye view, drop down in the groove, and if you can see again my cursor, this is what that groove would look like if you were looking from above the record, looking down on it. The left channel is where my cursor is. Hopefully my cursor is in the dark gray section for you. And as you can see, it's not modulated. There's a straight line. But on the right channel, part of the groove, because it's going in a 45-degree motion, it looks like a nice curvy line. But as you can see back down here, in this, as this groove is being formed, this is a cross-sectional view of what the groove looks like as it's being formed. What the groove is getting deeper and then shallower, deeper and shallower. That is going to create a signal on the left channel. Now, or rather right channel. Left channel is just the opposite of that, right? Okay. So mono would be both of them working alternatively, and there is no change in the depth of the groove. It's purely a horizontally modulated signal. So again, over here where my cursor is, you see from a bird's eye view what that groove will look like. If you could zoom in on it, it's just a line that goes left, right, lazily, left, right, left, right, left, right. It doesn't change its depth. That is a perfectly horizontally modulated groove. So if there is a instrumentation in the center of you're playing a stereo recording, and there's instrumentation in the center of your speakers, whether it's a voice or a horn, it doesn't matter. That's being recorded just like this, as a purely horizontally modulated signal. It's basically a mono signal. And then of course, stereo, it's all over the place. Okay, and it'll form grooves that are very irregular, because there's just too many things going on for it to be a nice, clean, uniform groove. Okay, now I'm going to stop that share. I'm going to go to another one. Now, hold on. Let me get my screen straight here. Sorry. Oh, I could have just stayed right where I was. Okay, share this one. Okay, here we go. Sorry, I'm going to go back in here again. Okay, now this image is zoomed in on the stylus from the front. So let's see. How can I illustrate? You see me in the screen? That's the stylus. Okay. So, and this is the edge that touches the groove. Left channel over here, right channel over there. And you're looking at it straight on, just like the perspective you've got. That's what you're seeing in this image. And you'll notice it's not straight edged. Okay. There is a curve here. It's called a major radius. And I just want you to remember that for now. It'll come up a little bit later. There's a major radius here. Now, on a fine line contact stylus, like this model I have in my hand, that major radius will range from 30 microns to 100 microns. The replicant designs that Ortofon uses being the really big ones, the 100 microns. And some of the Japanese designs use the smaller radius, like 30 microns. Now so remember that major radius. Now the minor radius. Now this is looking at, again, looking in the camera at me in the picture. That's looking at this stylus from its side. Okay, so you see that ridge line here, and you see the ridge line really small, and it's where my cursor is. So that's called a minor radius, because that's a rounded edge, and that radius is like 3 microns. Now a micron is a thousandth, is a thousandth. There are 1,000 microns in a millimeter.
A millimeter.
Okay, 1,000 microns in a millimeter. All right, now I'm going to go back to this image. This is an image. Some of you seen this image before?
Yeah, just one comment. There is some stuff on the right side of the screen, so shift the picture so the point of interest is in the center of the screen. That'll be the best.
Oh, is the thing that's obstructing your view the image?
Yeah. On the right hand side.
If what's obstructing your view is the images of all of us, you can click, drag, and move that out of the way.
Okay, you can do that.
Okay.
So I don't have that obstruction on my screen, for example.
Okay. You can move.
Yeah. Okay. So this is an interesting image. This was an image I took with my microscope, looking at the left channel wall only of a record groove. This was a test signal on an Ortofon record, which I've since cut up into little pieces like this for use in very many different experiments that I do. And I angled the microscope at a 45-degree angle so I could see that groove in its full relief. Okay. And you can see these horizontal undulations. Those are the mechanical sine waves that will cause the stylus to move and generate the electrical signal. This is supposed to be about an 18,000 hertz signal right around here on this test track. And the distance between these two peaks is 11 microns. Now, a human hair could fit the entirety of this frame. A human hair, depending on whether it's a Nordic hair or a Mediterranean hair. Well, Mediterranean hairs are probably about 100 microns, and Nordic hair is probably about 60, 70 microns. So a Mediterranean hair could fit this whole frame, okay? And this is the scale that we're talking about. This is, however, we can actually resolve in our hearing undulations in the groove that are down to the nanometer range. Now, 1 nanometer is 1/1000th of 1 micron, or 1/100000th of 1 millimeter. It is just seemingly just infinitesimal for us when we think about it, that such tiny features become for us part of the musical landscape. So,
JR,
and that-
I'm really surprised to see how much vertical feature, how many vertical features.
Yes, that's a whole nother thing we'll get into, Fred. Fred is part of our Wally team where we're doing research on this stuff, and he's been fantastic. So yes, the vertical features, yes, I've actually, Joe Harley has sent me, I'm waiting for them to arrive, 3 cutter head styli. And I want to analyze those styli to see why is it making a serrated edge? Because it's a serrations you see. The vertical structure, there's serrations. So, and I won't get to it here, but the styli, for various reasons, will have to bounce up and down inside of a groove, so they could actually hear those serrations as musical features. Well, not musical, but all right. So, we got major, that's the major anatomy portion down. Any questions so far? No. Okay. All right, good. So let's start with VTF. Oh, so there is something I failed to show you here. I'm going to show you something else. This is pretty cool. Okay. You should see, this is from the Namiki website. Namiki is one of 3 major Stylus cantilever assembly manufacturers worldwide. And they make these assemblies that are used in many of your cartridges, because exceedingly, I don't know any manufacturer that makes I don't know a single cartridge manufacturer that makes all the parts. Most of them will buy these assemblies from Namiki, Ogura, or Geiger. Okay. Now, what I want you to notice about this, again, looking at my mouse, over here is the stylus. Hopefully, you can see that. Here is a stylus attached to the end of this cantilever, which goes into this pipe, which is affixed to this. This is called the coil bobbin, and around that will be wrapped by the cartridge manufacturer. The wiring will be wrapped around that. And then let me show you the next image. Okay, so here's one in practice. So, but this one, instead of having a square former, has a cross shaped former. Does the same thing, but you could use a square or a cross. It's not important. But so this cartridge manufacturer has wrapped the former, the coil bobbin, with the wiring, and then behind it, hopefully you can see my cursor, behind it is a compliant material. That is the part of the suspension and compliant material that allows this whole system, the Stylus cantilever assembly system, to move. It needs to be able to move. So this compliant material behind it allows that freedom of movement. Okay, on this particular design, the magnet is only on one side of this bobbin. And you can see it, it's that metal looking structure. And you see all those metal shavings? Yeah, that's metal dust that has been attracted to the magnetic pole. One more image. So here's a picture I took recently of a Hana Umami. And here, back here, you see they use a square coil bobbin former, and it's surrounded by a magnet in front of it. It's a magnet yoke in front of it. And then behind it is a compliant material. And then out of the frame will be yet another magnet. And the more magnetic flux field you can generate around that coil, the stronger the electrical signal will be. Okay. That is it for anatomy. Any questions? Okay, so when VTF, so VTF stands for the vertical tracking force, the tracking force that you would apply on that assembly, which is compliant, how much force is applied to it so that the stylus will perform the function of remaining in contact with the groove wall. Okay, remain in contact with the groove wall. We all know what mistracking sounds like, and mistracking is easily identifiable. It sounds kind of similar to what a cone breakup would sound like, you know, for your speaker cones. It's very unpleasant. It sounds like buzzing, very unpleasant sibilance. It's very easy to hear. Where you hear it from is important. When people call me and say they're getting sibilance, I always ask, which channel are you hearing it? Or are you hearing it smack dab in the center, or is it spread out between the two speakers? All right. I won't go into what each of them mean, at least not quite yet, but that helps me diagnose what's going on here. It may not, just because you're hearing mistracking doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have enough vertical tracking force. In fact, that's the last place I would look for it. The last place I would rather try to apply my fix. I would want to look first at my anti-skating and at the quality of my tone arm bearings. And I suppose also making sure that I don't have a compliance problem between my tone arm and my cartridge. So, but there's another function that affects the sonics on vertical tracking, assuming of course that you have maintained the contact between the stylus and the groove by having an adequate amount of vertical tracking force. Now, let's just say, well, let's add more vertical tracking force, okay? Let's just make sure that no matter what, it's gonna stay in contact. Let's just dial it up. Forgetting for a moment about stylus wear and groove wear. Forget about that for a moment. What will that do? Well, remember this picture. Remember this picture. The other one would have worked fine too. This coil former will move with, because it's a rigid structure, it will move with the whole cantilever assembly, okay? It will move with it. Now, if you have compressed, if you've caused a lot of compression on the on this compliant material here by applying a lot of vertical tracking force, what is happening? Well, the more compression you add to a compliant material, the stiffer it becomes, the less compliant it becomes. Look, just take your mattress. It's soft, and then you push harder on it, and becomes stiffer and stiffer, more resistance, right? Same thing happens here. Well, that by increasing your vertical tracking force to a point where you've compressed that material to the point where it's beyond its ideal mechanical operating range, you're going to get different behaviors out of your coil former, the coil bobbin, and it won't be behaving the same. Let's just put it that way. And Fred, by the way, Fred, if you can think of another way to articulate that, please, or anybody.
That makes sense. You're doing fine. Go ahead, JR.
What's that?
You're doing fine.
Okay, all right. So I always set my vertical tracking force to be just enough, and that's it. And just enough means I'm going to be listening for a while to a little bit of mistracking, and I just keep going up and up until I'm not hearing it on my recordings. All right. And no, I don't use one recording for all. Like I don't have, I mean, I have the Telarc 1812 Overture, where with that ridiculously high amplitude cannon shot. No, I don't want that to be my reference level, because I never listen to anything with that ridiculously high amplitude grooves. I want my compliant material to be as relaxed as possible, as long as my stylus is staying in the groove. Okay. So what you're, however, there's another component that you're changing when you apply pressure, additional pressure to a more vertical tracking force, you will cause the cantilever angle to go down. Okay, because there's additional force now. Cantilever goes down, and that's going to change your stylus rake angle. Does everybody know what the rake angle is? Stylus rake angle? It is this. Let's see, I want to get good lighting on this. It's this orientation. There's the groove, it's this orientation. Okay, so
SRA, would you say that's the same as VTA? Or I know
no,
there's some people use them interchangeably, but
and I understand why, because they are linked. Okay, so stylus rake angle is the relationship between the contact edge of the stylus, which is right here, and the groove. What is that angle? Okay. Vertical tracking angle, because this is so difficult to see, most people don't talk about it. What they do talk about is what they can see, the vertical tracking angle, which is the relationship to the cantilever. My arm is now the cantilever. What's the relationship, the angular relationship to the cantilever angle and the record surface?
Yeah.
That's the vertical tracking angle. Now, I used to say, I don't care about vertical tracking angle. I just don't care. I only care about stylus rake angle because it's the contact edge of the stylus that reads the groove. And that's only, I think now I realize that's only partially right. I haven't considered the possibility, and we'll research this more in the future, that the actual angle that the cantilever rides through the groove at will change the mechanical relationship between how it actuates in relationship to the groove undulations. I like to, in order to explain that, I like to think of things in extremes. Imagine the cantilever was 90 degrees, okay, straight up and down, right? There's the stylus. Imagine the cantilever straight up and down, all right, riding through the groove. You can see that as there's a vertical component like this, what's happening to the cantilever, it's acting pistonically. And the motor assembly is not designed to act pistonically. It's not designed to act that way. Okay, let's start bringing it down. Let's start bringing it down. It's still acting pistonically. It's still acting pistonically. In fact, it will continue acting pistonically pretty severely until 45 degrees. And then very, very little will it be acting pistonically. But there's another element to that I won't go into. But and then imagine the opposite extreme. The cantilever is 0 degrees and somehow able to read the groove. Maybe it's got a long stylus, right? So the mechanical relationship between the way the grooves were formed and the way they were formed originally by the cutter head stylus, which is itself at its own vertical tracking angle. It's not reading those undulations in the same manner. It would help if I had drawings for this, and one day I will. But the point of this is, and I'm sorry if I've lost some of you, that I believe that the actual angle of the cantilever, irrespective of the stylus rake angle, could be influential in the sound. But I don't yet understand how yet, and that'll be a field of future resource. And I've never seen any. I've seen studies in the past on vertical tracking angle, but they are in significant need of updating.
I would say, JR, that for most people, to measure SRA, you really need a microscope, I believe.
Yeah, you do.
Right. And for most people, even a lot of people with expensive systems and expensive cartridges, they don't have that, but they can measure VTA. And while they're not the exact same thing, they tend to move in the same direction. And if you're going to, try to, get your tone arm and your VTA, starting off at least with at the minimum with the arm perfectly perpendicular to the record, it gives you, you're using VTA and it gives you a starting point to make incremental changes if you want to do it through here. So that's, I think that's the reality of it. I mean, SRA is great, but for most people, VTA is all they really have to deal with.
That's right. That's correct. And so what many people will do is they'll find a method to level the head shell, maybe with the Wally reference, right? And they'll find a method to level the head shell and then start playing with it by ear, right?
Yes.
Now, the challenge with the challenge with doing that is that when you raise and lower the tone arm, on most tone arms, you're also changing the vertical tracking force simultaneously because they're not neutrally balanced. Most tone arms aren't neutrally balanced. So you've got that you're listening to. So how do you know? You hear a change, which was that change, that sonic change, subjective change, a function of what? Secondly, quite a number of tone arms do not have they are what I call indirect azimuth. We call it indirect azimuth tone arms, meaning that what happened. Let me show you something. Okay, this is my lab table. Okay, I got two arms on my lab table. They're both different Kuzma arms. Do you notice how here's the arm wand? It's at an angle to this yoke. This is the bearing, and it's this, and then this yoke is holding on to it. Do you notice it's at an angle, right? It's not perpendicular. That's why do many tone arms do that? Many tone arms do that so that when you do raise and lower the tone arm, you aren't also changing the azimuth angle. But if you've got a unipivot, you raise and lower you're raising and lowering your tone arm, you're also changing your azimuth. Interestingly, these 4 points, I didn't even realize this, but underneath the I'm not going to take it off right now, but this is actually a true azimuth tone arm as well, because the points are mounted at an angle, not orthogonally to that. So I thought that was interesting. So if you have a tone arm, that has that offset, it's called an offset yoke, then when you raise and lower the tone arm, you are not also changing azimuth. If you don't have that, that's another thing you're going to be hearing when you change. People think, oh, I'm going to change my VTA. I'm going to drop my arm. Well, you might have changed 3 things. And if you change your vertical tracking force enough, you're going to change your skating force. And if your skating force changes, well, then that could influence the angle of the cantilever.
I have a question.
You're going to say something?
Taking it individually, just changing VTA and not assuming you can change VTA without affecting VTF or azimuth. There's a lot of people, write that, oh, if I lower the VTA, things get a little warmer, maybe a little slower. If I raise it up, it gets a little faster. Is that true? And if it is true, why would, and not taking into effect that you're changing VTF as well and all that, if that's true just to the angle, can you explain why that is consistently talked about and maybe if why that might be true?
Not yet. That's the short answer. I can't explain that yet. The mechanical studies that we've done so far with that involve Stylus rake angle, VTA changes to VTA, haven't so far revealed any significant reason mechanically to see why a change in rake angle would change a whole lot in terms of the mechanical relationship between the groove and the stylus. The only thing we've been able to see so far, and we're not done, we've just started. The only thing we've been able to see so far is that changes in rake angle will change the height at which the Stylus will ride in the groove.
Okay.
So it'll ride a little higher, ride a little lower. I don't have an answer for that yet. I would be completely I would be too much conjecture for me
Yeah,
at this
fair enough,
point.
though, but thank you.
Yeah. So, but when, people say that, I've heard, I'm sure you've seen it as well, people want to change the height of their record to adjust, change the height of their tone arm to adjust for various record thickness. I think that's just a waste of time.
I have a question. There's a lot of 200 grams plus records being produced these days. I don't know why, but say you have a 120 gram record and a 200 gram record, would there be a note? Could you anticipate that there might be a difference in, say, bass or something like that, and something like that, because you're changing all those things you just mentioned potentially? What do you think of 200 gram records?
Okay, so yeah, it's a fair question. It's a good one. So there are some IEC standards for the thickest and the thinnest records, and the difference between them is about 1.3 millimeters. Okay, and now, so let's just say, and the thinnest record would be the Dynaflex that really nobody listens to, and those are really thin. But 85% of all the records out there that people listen to, at least audiophiles, are going to be about a millimeter, 0.1 difference between the thickest and the thinnest. Now, what does that mean in terms of change in rake angle or vertical tracking angle? Well, on a 9-inch tone arm, it would be about 1/4 of a degree. Now, I can't hear 1/4 of a degree change in rake angle. No way. I could hear 1/4 degree change in azimuth angle, but not rake angle. Now,
how much does the angle for cutter styli vary? Is that swamp?
Yeah, so that depends, and that's another good question, and that varies depending upon the type of lathe. So I recently had an exceptionally quiet record sent to me by it was a Music Matters album. I just couldn't believe how quiet it was. So I asked, at what angle was the stylus? Because I believe that the quietest grooves will actually be cut with a stylus less than 90 degrees. He misunderstood my question, and he said 18 degrees, and he was referring to the vertical tracking angle of the armature that holds the stylus in the cutter head. So from what I've read in disc cutting books, most of the angles for the cutter heads are in the neighborhood of 15 to 22 degrees. Okay. So my feeling, of course, yes, I analyze my contact edges with microscopy and leave it at that. Now, what to do if you don't have that luxury? If you have an offset yoke, you want to play with tone arm height to see how the sound does change. First, confirm that whether your arm is a neutral balance or not. What does that mean? Well, measure the VTF with an accurate scale where it is right now, then raise it up a few millimeters, measure it again. Is it the same mass reading? If so, great. Go start playing with height and have at it. I can tell you that statistically, all the cartridges that I analyze, the vast majority of them will need to be adjusted with butt down, not up. All right, so if I just had to just say, guess what any Joe Blow's cartridges needed, it would be butt down. And it's pretty significant. The average, I've recently tabulated all of the cartridges that I analyzed in the last year, and the average correction that I needed was something like 3.1 degrees. Most tone arms will not correct 3.1 degrees. On a 9-inch tone arm, 3.1 degrees is about 14 millimeters. That's a little more than half an inch. Most of them won't travel a full half an inch down. Yeah. either the arm wand will hit the record, or they just won't go down quite that far. All right. So I can move on from here to say Azimuth. Any other questions before I do? Okay. All right. I'm going to show you something related to Azimuth. Hold on. Let me set up for it. Okay. And now some of you have probably seen this already, but I think it's worth a look. I find this so, whoops. Going quickly, here we go. Here we go. All right. So you see this animation, it's going to start here. So this is the Stylus cantilever assembly moving in its 45-degree path. It's just one channel modulating. There's the coil bobbins, and as you notice, the white bobbin is moving nicely, and that's creating electrical signal, and the red one is really not moving. You notice that? The red one's really not moving. Now, if you twist the bobbin a little bit, and now start the 45-degree motion again. Now look, now they're both moving. The white one is certainly moving more, but the red one, which corresponds to the other channel, is moving a little bit now, and that's crosstalk. And that's what we want to avoid, because when you get the left channel musical content playing in the right channel and vice versa, you are decreasing your stereo separation. When you decrease your stereo separation between left and right channels, the entire sound field gets a little more confused, the soundstage collapses, imaging becomes not pinpoint, but diffuse. The overall sonic character becomes more, becomes congested sounding, less coherent and intelligible. So you want to avoid this. You want to maximize stereo separation. And that is why we adjust on the Azimuth for the greatest stereo separation, which must be done electrically, not visually. The average of that same data set I told you about, of all the cartridges that I analyzed over the last year, the average Azimuth error correction was just barely under 1.1 degrees. Now, that might not sound like very much, but if I change, on most cartridges, if I change my cartridge by 1/4 degree, have you listened before and after, you'd hear the difference. You'd say, oh, why did the soundstage get a little more compressed? Why does it seem a little less intelligible, right? And that has to be done electrically. There's just no other way around it. But you can do it with a multimeter and a test record. At very least, you could do it with that. And on my blog, on the Wally School blog and website, if you read the articles, there's an article that will lead you to those instructions and materials to be able to do that. So that, any questions about Azimuth?
Yeah, can I ask a question about what you just said?
Yeah.
So in order to measure that electronically, you have to have a cantilever that's sort of perfectly aligned, right? I have a Soundsmith AIDA.
Yes.
Soundsmith, I'm sure you've probably heard, doesn't really necessarily endorse the phosgometer setup, saying that it variations in the way in manufacturing could make that not work. What do you think of that?
Right.
You know?
Okay. So, and I get Soundsmiths pretty regularly, and Peter Letterman, who I got a lot of respect for, I suspect that part of what he's trying to avoid is there is a lot of confusion, market confusion about how to interpret the measurements and out there. And his cartridges do give really excellent crosstalk results. They do. And once you get over 35, 34 dB, if it's not perfectly balanced, the idea is you want it balanced. So say 35 dB crosstalk in one channel and 35 dB in the other. That's ideal. but most cartridges won't get that high. Most cartridges will be in the very low 30s or the high 20s, okay? So what Peter's point is, look, once you get at 34, 35, I don't care if one channel is 42 and the other is 35. Those are so far above the noise floor, just have at it. And my response is, I think generally I understand why you would say that, and I think there's nothing unacceptable about that. However, I do have enough experience with the cartridges to know that I can further optimize them. And what happens when I further, and I just had one just last week, it was the voice. I did put it at an angle, it ended up about a degree, a little bit more. And another benefit I had by putting it on that tilt, on that azimuth angle, rather than perfectly level, was that it perfectly balanced the output of the two channels too, just by coincidence. That generally happens. So instead of having a half a dB difference between channel output left and right, I was able to get it perfectly balanced, and the overall crosstalk was something like 36 and 36, which is excellent. So yeah, does that help?
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
I don't think I can tell the difference if I'm hearing something wrong. It sounds great. I'm using that acoustic sounds. Actually, I've got about 5 different test records that I use, and the azimuth test, as you know, has pretty much stayed the same for years. That sort of channel in either side, and sonically, I set it up until you can't hear anything, and it sounds incredible.
Oh, so you do the minimization of sound?
Yeah.
Test? Oh, that's channel balancing. That's nothing to do with crosstalk.
Oh, okay, but that's azimuth, right?
When you change the cartridge on its azimuth, you can affect the channel balancing, yes, but that's not necessarily where your best crosstalk will be. Where you will find the lowest output of that signal is not necessarily at all where the maximum channel stereo separation will be.
Okay.
That's not an electrical test. That's a sonic test, and is also subject to all the rest of your system being perfectly balanced in terms of output. All right. So that's not the ideal way.
Okay.
Definitely not.
How do us simpletons who don't really have all that neat equipment, how do we get ours set up so it's proper? So
Send them to JR.
Yeah. Yes. Send it to me. I'll analyze it and set it back with instructions on how to align it. Or you invite people like Greg over.
Well, if I bring the wine, would that help?
Wine is the wonderful lubricant.
But JR did mention that you can do some of these adjustments yourself with just a meter, and he has the instructions for that up on his website.
Yeah, with a multimeter, yes. And that's how I would encourage you to do it, with a multimeter and a test record. Now, a test record is a whole nother issue. That's a totally separate subject, but I got a real beef to pick with test records, big time.
Let's move ahead. Let's move on.
Okay. What's next? Okay, well, there's a Zenith. Okay, let's talk about Zenith. So, Zenith era refers to, when we align our cantilever using a protractor, hopefully a Wally tractor. Dear God, hopefully a mirrored protractor at least, okay? What we're doing is we're aligning the cantilever to be perfectly tangential to the groove at the null point. So, but we're running on a leap of faith when we do that with our fine line contact styling. And again, I should have said this at the outset. If you have a conical styling, don't listen to anything I have to say because I can't help you. Okay? Can't help you. Even some ellipticals that are real major, big radius. I can't help you. You will not, it's a mechanical certainty, you will not get everything there is in the groove. You can only do that by replicating the cutter head. The cutter head has a 2 micron radius to its sharp edge, okay? And that's what these fine line contact styli, which most of us have, that's what they're trying to replicate. However, when we align our cantilever, we're running on the faith that the manufacturers have aligned this contact edge perfectly perpendicularly to the cantilever, which we can see. And on average, the error is what did I come up with? 2.15 degrees. Well, that's tantamount to aligning your cantilever off by 2.15 degrees, which is pretty apparent. In fact, let me share my screen. I'm going to show you something else. Where is it? Oh man, I don't know if I've got it up right now. The tolerance errors that are afforded by at least two of the major manufacturers of Stylus cantilever assemblies for the Zenith error. And the Zenith error, again, is the error represented by the lack of perpendicularity between this contact edge and the cantilever. Their tolerance is plus minus 5 degrees. Now, with most of your head shells, the maximum amount of rotational freedom you have to rotate your cartridge in your head shell is about 5 degrees. So you can imagine how skewed that would look. And that is, to the manufacturers, acceptable, which I find unacceptable. Because now what does it sound like? All right. I do have something I can show you. Hold on. Here we go. Here's a good example. So this stylus was mounted in this diamond block here, 3.3 degrees out of orthogonal relationship to the cantilever. But I don't care about the stylus. I care about this, the contact edge. Can you guys see that black and white little? That is the contact edge. I care about that. But what's so unusual about this is, look at this. This is the same stylus. I've now measured what's the relationship between the shank and the contact edge. Well, it's 7 degrees off. These are the tolerances that we're paying thousands of dollars for. So ultimately, all I care really is what's the relationship then between this contact edge and the cantilever, and in this case, it nets out to 2.3 degrees error, which is totally correctable. Okay, so but I've seen $10,000 cartridges at 10 degrees error. I've seen as much as 14 degrees error on very expensive cartridges. And this is because the cartridge manufacturers aren't inspecting for it because they don't have the means. That's what I'm hearing from them anyway. So what does it sound like? So you could experiment with this yourself if you simply take your cartridge and just spin it all the one way to its maximum point, tie it down again, and play it. What will you notice? When there's not a good relationship between the contact edges and your grooves, when there is a zenith error present, what happens is that the soundstage shrinks in depth and in height and width. With the image specificity, instead of being pinpoint, is kind of diffuse, a little harder to identify where things are in space. Overall intelligibility suffers. High frequency extension suffers, and like having that nice long shimmer and decay of a cymbal strike, that long decay suffers. When it's all dialed in, when zenith error is not present, you've adjusted for it, corrected for it, you get this big see-through soundstage with pinpoint imaging and great intelligibility. Everything is just really, really, everything, there's a great coherence to the sound. Yeah, questions? So I have the beginnings of a subjective test for zenith error, but I've got to refine it a little bit better because it only works for error in one direction. Now I got to do the instructions for what if the error is in the other direction. So, and again, if you have an elliptical stylus, this doesn't matter as much because you've got a much oh, let me have you guys seen this video?
JR, I have a question.
Yeah, Bruce.
Okay, it's geometry.
Yeah.
So you've got, let's say your zenith angle is 3 degrees out, one side or the other.
Yeah.
Now you're twisting your head shell 3 degrees. Now your cantilever is not perpendicular or parallel to your running groove.
Yeah.
So ideally, you want your cantilever to be like the cutting head.
Yeah.
In other words, at 90 degrees. And now you're kind of, what does that do? Would that not, due to the drag and just the record trying to have the stylus go in because of the friction, would that not do some kind of distortion?
Okay, so yeah, so the question is, I'm going to repeat to make sure you correct me if I didn't hear this correctly. As you change the alignment of your cantilever in order to compensate for the zenith error, wouldn't that misalignment of the cantilever relative to the travel in the groove cause a problem?
Right.
Okay. Right.
You're correct.
Okay. So within 5 degrees, at the amount of correction that we're even able to do in the average head shell, the answer is the changes, the mechanical changes are infinitesimal. I mean, we've calculated already what the decrease in the output of the signal, because there's a slight decrease in the output of signal, and it's infinitesimal. All right, and also theoretically as well, the more you change this angle, the more you're going to cause a pistonic action, which you don't want, which the motor is not built for. A pistonic motion will come into play for vertical modulations. Well, again, within 5 degrees, that's so infinitesimal as to not be an issue. Once you get 10 degrees and more, it becomes then that starts playing in. But 10 degrees is zenith error is outside of the acceptable tolerance by the manufacturers, and it's more than you can adjust for in the average head shell anyway. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. I was just curious because of the drag and everything else, the angle wasn't right. So again, like you said, it would be more of a piston action than if it gets out there too far. But it sounds right that 5 degrees doesn't, you
got to go a long way for that to become a problem.
Okay.
Far more than we can do. Okay. So just to show you, I just love this. Let me put this up. Oh, I want to share my screen. Once again, I want you to see this video. I know some of you have already seen it, but this is a oops, it's having me start over. Sorry, guys. I thought I was starting it right there. Sorry. Okay. All right. So here's an animation done by somebody on our Wally team of what the effects of zenith error are. So on the left is the representation of a fine line contact stylus riding through a horizontally modulated groove. So left, right only, right?
In other words, a mono record.
A mono record, or an instrumentation right in the center of your 2 speakers, right? On a otherwise stereo recording. On the right is the same signal in that groove and the same stylus profile, except a zenith error has been introduced. Notice now, and the spring things, you see the spring things on these axes. The spring helps you see how a vertical modulation has been introduced. So this groove has 0 vertical component to it. There's no vertical part of the signal that's in the groove. But when you introduce a zenith error on a fine line contact stylus, you are going to get that stylus going now up and down, and it's going in an ovular fashion right now. And that means something totally new for the electrical signal that's not on the record. It's related to, directly related to what's on the record, but the timing is off. Now phase relationships are all messed up. Okay, and this is, so then this causes the sound stage to just overall lose its sense of cohesiveness, musical signal overall losing its intelligibility, and of course the high frequencies suffer as well. So I think there was a question here. Samuel Figueroa asks, how does the sound deterioration of zenith era different from azimuth era? There are some similarities. Okay, zenith era will definitely affect. You'll hear it in what you'll hear it with zenith era that you won't hear with azimuth era is the effect to the high frequencies. Okay, with azimuth era you could tilt it on axis and it shouldn't change how the high frequencies behave. But both of them affect the overall sense of intelligibility and the size and depth of the soundstage and the specificity of the image. So just because you've adjusted your azimuth for even crosstalk and now you're enjoying a bigger soundstage with greater image specificity doesn't mean you don't necessarily have more to get by also fixing your zenith error if it exists, right? So I would like to be able to tell you, look, listen for this to fix that. Listen for the other thing to fix the other thing. It's a multivariate environment. You guys have heard me use that word before, which makes this, it's beyond oversimplification, which is why I insist upon measuring these errors, these angles, these relationships directly using microscope when possible, so that the other parameters aren't influencing the results I get. Okay, so VTF, VTA, rake angle, azimuth, zenith. What am I missing?
Maybe talk a little bit about antiskate, and then it's almost 8 o'clock, so we should try to.
Okay, let me show you a video. Let me show you another video. Okay, let me find it first. Okay. Oh, okay, I found it. All right. This is pretty cool. Okay. All right, you see my screen again? You see a big cartridge?
Yes.
All right. So pay attention to this cantilever. All right. What I'm going to do with this video, I'm going to start and stop the record and watch what happens to the cantilever angle. Okay, watch it, wait for it to relax. There, it's relaxed. Okay, there, see how it straightens up? As soon as friction is present, it changes the cantilever angle. You see that? There, it's straightened up again. See that? That's the impact of skating force. Okay, skating force is causing this cantilever angle to change. Okay, and it is changing, in this case, by 2.4 degrees. And this is one of a few reasons why you need to apply an anti-skate force. Because if I do not have an anti-skate force applied in this particular example, then for all of the efforts and time and money I've spent on the tools and the process to align my cantilever properly, if I don't apply an anti-skate force, as soon as that stylus touches a moving record, my cantilever is off by 2.4 degrees. And when my cantilever is off, cantilever angle is off by 2.4 degrees, so is my zenith. This is why we apply anti-skate, to fight that force as much as possible. And the average that we go for is 10% of your vertical tracking force, 10%. Test records, please do not use them. Please do not use test records to set your anti-skating force. You will most certainly be applying too much force. Definitely be applying too much force. The interesting thing about, I know some people like to use, kind of back to VTF, people like to use the tracking, test track tests. And then they tend to get obsessive about, well, wait, I can't track the third to the highest or the second to the highest test track. I get distortion. And my answer, I don't care. Those test tracks are absolutely torturous for a reason, but they have the torturous tracks have almost no relationship to what's on most of our musical signal. I've looked at the Ortophon test record under the microscope, and their 80 micron, which isn't even their highest one, but it's the one people tend to try to be able to track. They're 80 micron, which means it's 80 microns. I even got a picture of it I could show you. Okay, let's see. I got that. This is pretty cool. Let's see where it is. Right here. Is it? Okay, yeah, now I'm gonna share again. Look at this. All right, so this is the Ortophon test record. You see my screen again?
Mm-hmm.
So this is the oh, this is the 100 micron. I didn't realize that. I had 315 cycles. So 100 microns. This stylus, looking in my camera, this stylus is 1,000:1 scale representation of a stylus, kind of modeled kind of on the Lyra stylus, not exactly, but the Lyra stylus is 100 microns wide. Okay, what this test track is expecting you to do is transit at 315 times per second, not 100 microns, but 200 microns, twice the width of this stylus, 315 times per second. There isn't a musical signal that's going to ask you to do that, unless it was irresponsibly recorded by the engineer. So some people get obsessive about being able to track these. I say, please don't. Okay. So, yeah.
So JR, how would you suggest most mere mortal people, if they are setting their anti-skate, I mean, you know, because do all tone arms, will they tell you approximately where 10% is? You know, for example, we were talking about, I have a SME 5 arm, and you were saying you believe that the one that it goes from 1 to 2, whatever, that represents, if I have my VTF at, let's say 2, and I set this at 2, it's actually still 10% of 2 grams. But I tried to find that in literature. I haven't been able to find that. But for other people, how do they know that they're going to be getting to about 10%? And is there any way of listening as you set anti-skate to come?
Good point. Okay. So the only way I know to measure horizontal force is with a Wally skater. Okay. And there are a couple companies that claim to calibrate those anti-skate mechanisms. So if you're using, and I think those are Rega, SME, and maybe Lin. So they say, well, if you're using 2 grams tracking force, then on the anti-skating, put it to the 2, which will correspond with 10%. I remember measuring and reading that in the past. However, in practice, this is often not what you're getting. Just last week, I had a guy with one of those, I won't say which one, but one of those 3 brand tone arms. And he said, and he's got a Wally skater. He said, JR, he said, what's going on with my tone arm when I have it at, he's tracking at 1.5 grams. He said, when I put it at 0.5 on the anti-skating, which should be a lot less than what he should be at. The Wally skater tells him he's at 15% anti-skating, which is too much. He should be at 10. So I said, well, turn it off and just turn it to 0. And what do you get? We got 12%. What's happening? What's happening with this arm, and I see this all too often. Either the anti-skate mechanism, there's something wrong with it, and it's applying pressure when it shouldn't be, right? Or more likely, what's happening is that when in the factory, when the tone arm wires were routed through the tone arm and past the pivot point to the exit area, they were either twisted too hard or misrouted, and those tone arm wires are acting upon the tone arm horizontally, providing a horizontal force that shouldn't be there. This is actually exceedingly common. And if you've got a tone arm that has the loop of wire that's exposed, it's even more common. In some brands more than others. I'm not going to name names right now, but so knowing that it exists is very important, because if you've got either too much or not enough anti-skating, one of the symptoms I hear, I haven't experienced it for myself because I haven't experimented with it and I don't live with it. Okay. But what I hear from people is that after they get the Wally skater and they realize they're either way overdone or way underdone, and then they change it to a setting that the Wally skater says where they should have it, what they report back to me is that the sound becomes more relaxed. And what else do I hear? The sound is more relaxed and more open. What does that mean? I don't know. I don't spend much time, and perhaps it would be helpful if I did spend much time listening to what poor setup sounds like.
Can I ask you?
Hey, JR,
Yeah.
I have an SME arm, and it's their basic M2-9R, which is the new version, I guess, their new version of the 3009. It's not anywhere near the same, but it's all different. But anyway, in the instructions, when I was working with it, it said that on the anti-skating, for every gram, each one of those little marks, that they have a little arm, which each one of those represents a half a gram. So I have it at 1.7, and then I have that set at 3 little clicks.
Okay, and so what they're saying, trust the device, because they're saying it should be a calibrated anti-skating device, and SME is one of at least 3 manufacturers that I believe claim to calibrate them, and I'm saying, well, great, I'm glad that they do that, but I just have learned not to trust.
I hear you.
I just have learned not to trust. I believe that it is entirely possible that the anti-skating mechanism could be properly calibrated, but what they're not accounting for is a bearing that's damaged and causing a force one way or the other, or misrouted tone arm wires, or too tightly twisted tone arm wires, so that not accounting to the force that those are causing. There's a question here from Darren about how did I arrive at 10% for anti-skate, which is an excellent question. So these studies were done a few times in the 50s and the 60s to determine what percentage of the anti-skating force is, what percentage of your vertical tracking force on an average musically modulated record will represent skating force. Okay, how much skating force is generated as a percentage of your tracking force? And those studies came up with 10%. Now, then there was a YouTube video done in Russian, from Russia, just very recently. A guy came up with a really interesting experiment using an arm with its pivot floating on water, and we had it translated, and we took the figures from that he shared from this experiment, which was measuring frictional forces, right? And we did the calculations, and Lo and behold, it came up to 10% skating force, which means we got to apply 10% anti-skating force to fight it. With all that said, we have all the equipment that we need to do these coefficient of friction tests again, which we intend to do, because things have changed since the 50s and 60s. Stylus profile has become more severe. The contact area has changed, and while increased contact area doesn't matter with the coefficient of friction, it does if you take into account deflection of the record against all of that anyway. And so vinyl formulations have changed. So it's time to redo the tests. But for now, the best science that exists is 10% on average. A little bit less if you've got a longer arm, so 12-inch arms, you're going to aim at 9%, right? And if you're for a 12-inch arm, 9%. For a 9-inch arm, you're going to aim at 11%. Okay, it's inexact application because skating force changes depending on where on the record the stylus is. It also changes depending on how highly modulated the groove is. So it's an approximation at best. Okay. All right.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I have a VPI tone arm, and it has that funky mechanism with the rubber rings. So say I was to use like the Wally anti-skate setup tool. One of the things they mention is the twisting of the wire.
Yeah, please don't do that.
Should I just leave the wire alone if I'm setting my anti-skate, or should I take that into consideration? I mean, what do you know?
Please don't use the wire. As you begin to twist, so you twist the wire to apparently set the anti-skating force at the outer area of the record, but then as the arm swings towards the inner area of the record, what's it doing? It's tightening. It's tightening further, right? And you don't know where you are until you measure, right?
Yeah.
So you've got what my position is: what can be measured should be measured. Full stop. Right. And so
the wire is something that's should it be untwisted completely, or
probably not, because that will create its own forces because it's already in its relaxed position twisted. Okay, because it's been twisted mechanically, and that has caused the metal inside of the wires to find a new relaxed position. Okay. If they were given complete freedom, they wouldn't unwind. It's not spring metal. Right? It doesn't have that much memory to the metal. Yeah. So what adjustments can you make on a Rega turntable? Yes, you're limited to height. You can buy the aftermarket shims. See, Rega rightfully, and you can't change azimuth on a Rega, but Rega rightfully, and I gotta hand them to this, they put a primacy on rigidity. And I completely agree that tone arms above all should be rigid. However, as long as you've got a well-designed azimuth adjustment mechanism, the slight loss of rigidity that you would have, that you would suffer as a result of having an azimuth adjustment method, a good one at all, in no way outweighs the improvement that you would get from maximum stereo separation. No way. Now, if all cartridges were made perfectly, you wouldn't have to change it to be anywhere but perfectly level. Unfortunately, that is not the case. And a 1/4 degree and 1/2 degree of change is audible for azimuth. Okay. And let's see. So, if you do have a Rega though, get from me the Wally fulcrum, which gives you the freedom that's easily controllable to change that azimuth angle. Very easy to control. So, there's that. That is that. Any other questions?
Yeah, JR, have you heard of the Archie head shell?
I have.
Have you seen it? I thought I could put it on my SME 309. It doesn't. It goes on the it's the twisted end like the 3009.
Yeah.
And I was hoping I might even get into it, and if it's worth it, modify my 309 to put that in. I can sleeve it and everything else. What do you think about that head shell? I mean, it seems like it's very well engineered.
Well, so I don't have any direct experience with it, but one thing what I do like about it is that it offers you the ability to change your rake angle at the head shell, which is, in my mind, preferential than changing the tone arm height. Okay.
Yeah.
It's more tedious because every time you change that shim, you will have to set your overhang and your cantilever angle and stuff. But the principle is good. Is it really rigid? I don't know. Rigidity really is everything. As long as you can compensate for the errors that invariably exist in our cartridges, it's everything. Yeah. I mean, the ideal tone arm would be an infinite mass tone arm.
So, hey, JR, I'm going to pick this up. If people want to stay on and ask you questions, but it's 8 o'clock, it's been 2 hours.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fine. Oh, a quick plug. The Audiophile Society of the East Coast is kind of a conglomeration, the Audiophile Society of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. So they've got a YouTube channel, and they just published a really interesting and long video with Charles Kermis. And really interesting information that came from there that I haven't seen from Charles before, having to do with the experimentation of cavitational effects on aluminum foil to determine whether it's working or not. Really interesting. So check that out. It's a good job.
Yeah.
Thank you, JR. Excellent talk. Really appreciate it.
So Jim, before you cut everybody off, there's one question about setup pricing from JR. Could he respond to that, please, before everyone goes away? Did you see that, JR?
Yeah, thank you. So are you talking about the cartridge analysis?
I don't know. There's a question that said, could you give us some information on your setup pricing?
Oh, okay. So I've got a suite of tools. I'm not done yet. I've still got some more tools to create for all of the parameters. But there's the Wally tractor to set overhang and cantilever alignment. That's $495, and that includes the pivot to spindle ruler. There's the Wally skater, which measures horizontal forces, which is more. Wally skater is my favorite tool. Period. My favorite. This one right here. My favorite tool. This finds more problems than anything. So it's not just for setting anti-skating, but also making sure that you don't have too much stiction with your arm, or that there's those horizontal forces pushing it one way or another that you'll need to adjust for. The Wally fulcrum is the tiny little part that goes for you would use on a rega to be able to change your azimuth angle. It offers 4 degrees of freedom, which is probably more than you need. And then the Wally reference, which is a series of blades like this to one, start with perfectly leveling your head shell. And by the way, I've seen too many tone arms where the head shell is not parallel with the arm wand. So if you're looking at your arm wand to determine the parallelism of your cartridge with the record, particularly if it's a 3D printed arm, be careful. Okay, so a suite of these tools allow you to measure the angles and find parallelism. So I'm working on a tool to measure zenith error, because I think it's unacceptable that people have to send me their cartridge for analysis to measure on a microscope that costs more than my car. We've got to be able to put this out in the field. That's not acceptable. So I'm working on 2 different product paths for that, to put zenith error measurement in the hands of everybody.
JR, your analysis, tell me if I'm wrong, but your analysis of a cartridge and producing a shim for it for the zenith error is about about 500. Is that correct?
Yeah, the analysis, which includes a corrective shim, is 500. Yep. And I make this custom shim for every cartridge that will, given a perfectly level head shell, which you accomplish with this, given a perfectly level head shell, and the installation of this shim in the proper orientation will take care of your rake and your azimuth right there. Boom. And then if you have a Zenith error, then you use Wally Zenith, which is a different tool, to rotate the cartridge in such a fashion that the contact edge of the stylus will be perfectly collinear with the radial line of the record. Yeah.
Does that answer everyone's question and kind of about his rates? You can certainly go to his website and get the price of the different tools that he has to offer for sale. And as Larry put out there, the society does have a few tools available in our lending library. So,
yeah.
Now this has been great. You've not only answered my questions, but now I've got 25 new questions to ponder when I'm setting up this stuff. There's so much to consider.
There's so much in the grooves to get. If you've got a fine line contact stylus, it's absolutely miraculous what's in those grooves.
Have you heard anything about contact lines, line contact stylus having wearing down styrene records? Is there any problem, or is it just
wearing down polystyrene records?
Yeah,
that's not an area I'm
okay
of competence for me. I don't know. No. Larry, it looks like you're about to say something.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna thank you for this great presentation. I think you've moved the bar on cartridge setup tremendously. Figuring out that it was a shock to me that there's so much error can occur in mounting the stylus on the cantilever.
Yeah.
And that's where the rubber meets the road, I guess you could say. So
yeah,
great.
It's shocking how much the industry tolerates.
Yeah.
And we're paying a lot of money for it. And there's more music to be had when it's properly aligned. Yeah.
Very good.
all right.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Just offhand, I have a couple of records that I use to set up when I'm setting up my speakers. I have a Bill Evans record, Explorations, where if you have it set up wrong, the snare drum will be on the left and the rest of the drum set will be on the right. But if you have the speakers dialed in and your cartridge dialed in, it'll give you a coherent sort of three-dimensional soundstage. Do you have any test records like that you feel really do it right? And like, can you recommend any records that are not, test records, but just general well-recorded records that you would use to set up a stylus, or that you would say if a correctly set up stylus would offer like a good,
well,
you know what I'm saying?
There's one that I use many different ones, but there's one I keep coming back to, and that's the Royal Ballet RCA Victor. And I tend to prefer, when doing evaluation, I tend to prefer classical because it's much more difficult to resolve. I'm causing a lot of extra work for the stylus cantilever assembly, all right? And if it's doing its job, I'm going to really feel the hall. I'm going to see the pinpoint in the instrumentations and pinpoint space, long, beautiful decay to the triangles, really fast percussive dynamic strikes to the timpanis and so forth. That's where, and of course the tonality. That's where I had. But I don't have one. I don't have one or two that I would say as a must-have. That's what really works for me. I keep coming back to. So if you find, I would recommend that you have in your small collection of evaluation records, make sure that one of them is a well-recorded classical piece, because if you don't get good tonality from masked strings, I don't care if you don't listen to classical at all, but if it doesn't sound like warm, sweet strings, something's off. And maybe you don't notice it because all you listen to jazz is rock, which is fine, you can live with it. But if you don't get that sweet warmth and with detail of masked strings, something's off. Period. Masked strings are definitely a litmus test for me, for sure.